In 1906, the largest corporation on Earth looked at 7 miles of empty sand dunes on the shore of Lake Michigan and decided to build a city from nothing. Not a neighborhood, not a factory district. An entire city with churches, theaters, hotels, schools, and homes for 100,000 people who did not yet exist. The United States Steel Corporation spent $65 million, roughly $2 billion in today's money, to construct both the biggest steel mill on the planet and the community that would serve it. But here is what no one said out loud. Every building, every street, every life in that city existed only because the math made sense. And math, eventually, always changes. Chapter 1. The corporation that bought the sand. Before a single brick was laid, a lawyer named Armanis Knotts was quietly buying 9,000 acres of swampland, and no one was allowed to know why. Knotts worked methodically through the autumn of 1905. He visited farmers and absentee landowners across the southern shore of Lake Michigan, in a flat stretch of northwestern Indiana, where sand dunes rose 60 feet above marshes thick with cattails. The land was nearly worthless, most of it flooded in spring. Nobody farmed it with any success. A few fishing camps dotted the lakefront. The nearest real town, Miller, sat a few miles to the west and had no reason to grow. This was exactly the kind of land a man could buy cheaply if he moved quickly and kept his mouth shut. Knotts had been given one instruction by his employers: do not reveal the buyer. If the sellers learned who was behind the purchases, the price per acre would triple overnight. So, Knotts used shell companies, intermediaries, and his own name. He paid between $50 and $200 per acre for land that would soon be valued at thousands. Within months, he had assembled a continuous parcel stretching 7 miles along the lake shore and reaching 2 miles inland. It was one of the largest private land acquisitions in Indiana history, and not a single newspaper reported it. The buyer was the United States Steel Corporation, and its ambitions for that swampland would reshape American industrial history. To understand why the largest company on Earth wanted sand dunes and marshes, you have to understand the company itself. U.S. Steel had been born just 4 years earlier, in 1901, through a merger engineered by J.P. Morgan that combined Andrew Carnegie's steel empire with nearly a dozen other producers. The resulting corporation was capitalized at $1.4 billion. That number stunned the world. It was the first billion-dollar corporation in history, controlling roughly 2/3 of American steel production and employing 250,000 workers. The man Morgan chose to lead this colossus was not a steelmaker. He was a lawyer from Wheaton, Illinois, named Elbert Henry Gary. Judge Gary, as everyone called him, understood something that Carnegie never fully embraced. Steel was not just a product, it was infrastructure, and infrastructure required control. Control of raw materials, control of transportation, control of labor. Carnegie had controlled ore and rail. Gary intended to control the workers themselves, not through violence or coercion, but through geography. If you built the town where the workers lived, you decided what they ate, where they worshipped, how they spent their wages, and whether they stayed. The company town was not a new idea, but Gary planned to execute it at a scale no corporation had attempted. The site in Indiana was chosen with the precision of a military campaign. It sat at the southern tip of Lake Michigan, where ore boats from Minnesota could dock directly at the mill. 7 major railroads already crossed the region. Chicago, the nation's freight hub, was only 25 miles to the west. The Calumet River could be dredged into a harbor. The flat terrain could be graded for the largest continuous mill complex ever designed. And Indiana, unlike Illinois, had labor laws so permissive they barely existed. U.S. Steel created 2 subsidiaries to execute the project. Indiana Steel Company would build and operate the mill. The Gary Land Company would build and manage everything else: the streets, the homes, the commercial district, the utilities, the parks. This was the architecture of total control, disguised as urban planning. The initial budget was $65 million, a figure that, in today's money, approaches $2 billion. Of that sum, roughly $40 million went to the mill and $25 million to the city. The corporation was spending nearly 40% of its budget on a town that existed for only one purpose: to keep workers close enough to the furnaces to show up on time. They named it after the chairman, Gary, Indiana, a city conjured from sand by the richest corporation the world had ever seen. It was not born from immigration or farming or the discovery of gold. It was born from a spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet had a column for every dollar spent and a formula for every dollar expected in return. The city was an investment. The people who would live in it were the labor that justified the investment. As long as the steel sold, the math worked. As long as the math worked, the city existed. But no one wrote that formula down where the residents could see it. Chapter 2. Building a City in a Snowstorm. On March 12, 1906, engineers marched through a blizzard into a landscape of 60-foot sand dunes, and the largest construction project in American industrial history began. The first crews were surveyors and graders. They arrived by rail from Chicago, stepping into a frozen wilderness that bore no resemblance to a city. The dunes rolled south from the lake in pale ridges. Between them lay hollows of standing water and scrub oak. The wind off the lake in March could drive snow horizontally. There were no roads, no structures, and no shelter. The men set up canvas tents, built fires, and began measuring a grid onto a landscape that did not want one. What followed over the next 2 years was an act of industrial will so enormous it altered the geography of the region. To build Gary Works, the mill complex, engineers first had to remake the earth itself. They leveled the tallest dunes with steam shovels and drag lines, pushing millions of cubic yards of sand into the marshes to create flat ground. They rerouted a section of the Grand Calumet River. They dredged a turning basin from the lakeshore to allow ore boats to dock directly at unloading machinery. They sank thousands of pilings into the sandy ground to support blast furnaces that would weigh tens of thousands of tons. The scale was staggering. Gary Works, when completed, would stretch 4 miles along the lakefront and 1.5 miles inland. It would contain its own railroad network, its own powerhouse, its own water treatment system. It was not a factory. It was an industrial district contained within a single property line. But U.S. Steel was not merely building a mill. It was building the world around the mill, and the ambition of that world was, for a corporate project, remarkably beautiful. The Gary Land Company laid out a formal city grid south of the mill, with Broadway as the central commercial spine. The streets were wide, paved, and lined with newly planted trees. The corporation installed gas lines, water mains, and a sewer system before the first residents arrived. It built a hotel, the Hotel Gary, to house visiting executives and traveling salesmen. It built schools. It donated land and money for churches. It constructed a commercial district along Broadway that was meant to rival the shopping streets of much larger cities. And then, as Gary grew, the architecture grew with it. City Methodist Church rose 9 stories on the corner of 6th Avenue and Washington Street. A Gothic cathedral built of Indiana limestone and steel that cost $800,000. Its sanctuary seated 950 worshipers beneath ribbed vaulting and stained glass. Adjacent to it stood Seaman Hall, a community center with a gymnasium, a theater seating 1,000, classrooms, and a swimming pool. The Palace Theater, designed by the legendary atmospheric theater architect John Eberson, opened on Broadway with a ceiling painted to resemble a Mediterranean sky at twilight, complete with twinkling electric stars and the silhouettes of distant villages. The Memorial Auditorium, completed in 1927 at a cost of $5 million, could seat 6,000 and hosted conventions, concerts, and basketball games. Union Station, built in elegant Beaux Arts style, connected Gary to the national rail network with the kind of civic grandeur usually reserved for state capitals. These were not modest buildings. They were statements: carved limestone, vaulted ceilings, ornamental iron, stained glass. The corporation wanted Gary to look permanent. It wanted workers to believe they were joining a city with a future, not a camp attached to a factory. Every Gothic arch and gilded lobby was a recruitment tool dressed in stone. The numbers tell the story of velocity. By 1908, just 2 years after construction began, the first blast furnace was lit. By 1909, Gary had a population of over 16,000. By 1920, it had reached over 55,000. Streets that had been empty sand 5 years earlier now held trolley lines, grocery stores, and children walking to school. The corporation had spent its $65 million, and the returns were flooding in. Gary Works was producing millions of tons of steel. The city was generating property taxes, retail sales, and a captive labor force that had nowhere else to go. It was, by every visible measure, a triumph. Visitors called it the Magic City. Postcards showed the gleaming mill, the handsome downtown, the wide boulevards. What the postcards did not show was the question buried in every foundation. Who owned all this beauty? The residents lived in it. They worked for it. They worshipped in it. But they did not control it. The corporation had built the church, the theater, the hotel, the station. The corporation had built the streets the church sat on. And the corporation's loyalty was not to the city. It was to the balance sheet that justified the city's existence. The beauty was real, but it was borrowed. Chapter 3. The Magic City and its Hidden Divide. By 1930, Gary's population had reached 100,000. Broadway was the shopping destination of Northwest Indiana, and the blast furnaces lit the sky every night like a second sunrise. Walk down Broadway in that era, and you would see a city that felt invincible. Department stores with plate glass windows. The Tivoli and Palace theaters running first-run Hollywood pictures. Restaurants, jewelers, haberdashers, shoe stores. The sidewalks were crowded on Saturday nights. Trolley bells rang at every block. The Memorial Auditorium hosted big band concerts and political rallies. The public schools were well-funded, the teachers well-paid, and the football team a regional power. Gary had a daily newspaper, a public library system built with Carnegie money, and a civic confidence that showed in the way people dressed to go downtown. The source of all of it was visible from every high point in the city. Gary Works, by now the largest integrated steel mill in the world, stretched along the lakeshore like a small nation. Its blast furnaces, open hearth furnaces, rolling mills, and coke ovens employed close to 30,000 workers at peak production. The mill ran around the clock, 7 days a week. The night sky above it glowed orange and red from molten metal and burning gas. You could feel the ground vibrate from the rolling mills a mile away. Families set their clocks by the shift whistles. 30,000 jobs, 100,000 people. A commercial district generating millions of dollars in annual retail sales. Property values climbing. New homes under construction in the neighborhoods south of downtown. By 1930, Gary ranked among the most prosperous small cities in the United States. The Magic City had delivered on its promise, but the magic had a boundary line, and it ran along the Wabash Railroad tracks. North of the tracks and east of Broadway, in the neighborhoods the Gary Land Company had planned and platted, stood the homes of skilled workers, foremen, managers, and the professional class. These were solid houses on paved streets with mature trees. The schools were new. The parks were maintained. The residents were overwhelmingly white, drawn from the native-born population, and the Northern European immigrants the corporation considered most desirable. Swedes, Germans, English, Scots. South of the tracks lay a different city entirely. The area known as the Patch, along with the neighborhoods of Midtown, was where black workers, Southern and Eastern European immigrants, and Mexican laborers were channeled by a system of restriction that did not need to be written into law because it was enforced by practice. The Gary Land Company did not sell lots to black buyers in the first subdivision. Real estate agents steered immigrant families away from certain blocks. The corporation's housing hierarchy matched its labor hierarchy. The most dangerous, lowest-paid jobs in the mill went to black and immigrant workers, and the worst housing in the city went to the same people. The numbers at the mill told the story plainly. By 1930, African-American workers made up a growing share of the labor force, concentrated in the coke plants and blast furnaces where the heat was most extreme and the injury rates highest. They earned less per hour than white workers doing comparable work. They were excluded from most skilled trades by union rules and foreman preferences. They worked the same 12-hour shifts and 66-hour weeks as everyone else, but they came home to houses the corporation had not built, on streets the corporation had not paved. This was not an accident, it was design. The company town model required control, and racial segregation was one of the most efficient control mechanisms available. A divided workforce does not organize easily. Workers who distrust each other across racial lines do not form unions. The corporation did not invent American racism, but it used American racism the way it used Indiana limestone, as raw material for construction. So Gary at its peak was two cities sharing one name. One was the magic city of the postcards, the Broadway shopping district, the Gothic church, the atmospheric theater, the Beaux Arts station. The other was a collection of overcrowded neighborhoods where families doubled up in houses meant for four, and children played in unpaved alleys within sight of the richest mill in the world. Both cities depended entirely on the same 30,000 jobs. Both existed because U.S. Steel needed labor, and both would be devastated when U.S. Steel decided it needed less. The furnaces still lit the sky. Broadway still gleamed on Saturday night. But the fault line was already in the foundation, waiting for the weight of decades to crack it open. Chapter 4. The workers who built the dream were never invited to live in it. South of the Wabash Railroad tracks, in a district U.S., Steel never mentioned in its brochures, 5,000 people lived in shacks and tents within sight of the richest corporation on Earth. The patch was Gary's original sin. It appeared almost as soon as the construction crews did, a sprawl of improvised shelters thrown up by workers who had no access to the company-built housing and no money for anything better. By 1910, the patch spread south and east of the mill in a ragged collection of tar paper shacks, boarding houses packed 8 men to a room, and actual tents that survived Indiana winters only because the men inside them had no alternative. There were no sewers. Water came from shared pumps that drew from contaminated ground. Outhouses served blocks of families. Typhoid was common. Infant mortality was high. The streets were mud. The people who lived in the patch were the people who had actually built Gary: Croatian stonemasons, Serbian laborers, Polish steelworkers, Hungarian millwrights, Greek railroad hands, and, increasingly, black men and women who had traveled north from Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia as part of the Great Migration, drawn by the promise of mill wages that were double or triple what they could earn picking cotton or cutting timber in the South. Close to 50 nationalities settled in northwest Indiana during the first 3 decades of the 20th century. They came because the mill was hiring. U.S. Steel recruited aggressively across southern and eastern Europe and, through labor agents, across the American South. The promise was simple: steady work, good wages, a new life. What was not promised was a place to live that resembled the life shown in the recruitment pamphlets. The corporation's approach to housing was revealing. The Gary Land Company built homes and sold lots in the planned neighborhoods north of the tracks. It invested in paved streets, sidewalks, shade trees, and utilities for those neighborhoods. It did not invest in the patch or the South Side. The corporation acknowledged that workers needed to live somewhere, but it made clear through its spending where the boundary of its concern lay. Skilled white workers and their families received a city. Everyone else received proximity to the mill and the freedom to figure out the rest. Inside the mill, the hierarchy was equally rigid. The most dangerous work fell to the newest arrivals and the darkest skinned. The coke ovens, where coal was baked into coke at temperatures above 2,000 degrees, were staffed almost entirely by black workers and recent immigrants. The blast furnaces, where molten iron erupted unpredictably, had similar demographics. The rolling mills, where white-hot steel was shaped into beams and rails, were marginally safer but still brutal. Across the entire complex, the standard work schedule was 12 hours on, 12 hours off, 6 days a week, with a brutal 24-hour long turn every other Sunday when the day shift switched to nights. That added up to 66 hours per week, minimum. In the summer, when demand was high, 70 and 80-hour weeks were common. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. Burns were routine. Amputations were not rare. Death on the job happened often enough that the mill maintained its own hospital. Elbert Gary, the chairman whose name the city bore, opposed unions with the calm certainty of a judge handing down a sentence. He did not shout about it. He did not hire Pinkertons as Carnegie had at Homestead. He simply refused to negotiate. He believed that a well-managed corporation could provide better for its workers than any union, and that labor organization was a threat to the efficient operation of industry. This philosophy was tested in September of 1919, when the Great Steel Strike shut down mills across the country. 350,000 steelworkers walked out, demanding the 8-hour day, union recognition, and an end to the 12-hour shift. In Gary, the strike was massive. Thousands of workers left the mill. The city's streets filled with marchers. The mood turned violent when strikebreakers were brought in. Indiana's governor declared martial law. Federal troops under General Leonard Wood, occupied Gary, setting up machine gun emplacements and conducting raids on union halls and immigrant neighborhoods. The message was unambiguous. The corporation's right to operate came before the workers' right to organize. The strike was broken by January of 1920. The 12-hour day continued for another 3 years, abolished only after public pressure mounted, and President Harding personally asked the steel industry to reform. But the damage was done. Workers understood, with a clarity that no pamphlet could have taught them, the terms of the arrangement. The corporation built the city. The corporation ran the mill. The corporation decided the hours, the wages, the working conditions, and, through the Gary Land Company, the geography of daily life. The workers provided labor. In exchange, they received wages and the use of a city they did not own, could not govern, and had no power to change. This was corporate paternalism at its most complete. The corporation provided schools, churches, parks, and entertainment. It provided clean water and paved streets in the neighborhoods it valued. It provided nothing in the neighborhoods it did not. The fundamental asymmetry was total. U.S. Steel could leave Gary at any time. The workers, who had uprooted their lives and moved their families to a city that existed for no other reason, could not. They were tenants in a company town that looked, from the outside, like an American city. But the lease was written in invisible ink, and only the landlord could read it. Chapter 5. The Sermon That Steel Built. Reverend William Seaman looked at a city full of saloons and brothels and decided the cure was a 9-story Gothic cathedral, paid for with money from the corporation that ran the saloon's customers ragged. Seaman arrived in Gary in 1920, a Methodist minister with the build of a rugby player and the ambition of a railroad baron. He looked at the city and saw what any honest observer could see, a community drowning in alcohol, vice, and exhaustion. The 12-hour shifts pushed men to seek escape. The saloons along Washington Street obliged. Gambling halls operated openly. Prostitution was not hidden. Gary in the 1920s was a wide-open town, rough-edged and raw, where the money that poured out of the mill flowed straight into the pockets of bartenders and bookmakers. Seaman believed the answer was not prohibition or policing. It was architecture. He believed that if you gave working people a building grand enough to inspire them, beautiful enough to compete with the saloon, and functional enough to serve their daily needs, you could reshape the moral life of an entire city. He wanted a church that was also a community center, a school, a gymnasium, a theater, and a social club. He wanted it to be the largest Methodist church in America, and he wanted it built in a city that was barely 20 years old. He got what he wanted because U.S. Steel paid for roughly half of it. The corporation had its own reasons for supporting Seaman's vision. A sober, church-going workforce was a productive workforce. A grand church on a prominent corner told the world that Gary was a city of permanence and respectability, not a company camp. The interests of the pastor and the corporation aligned perfectly, as long as neither looked too closely at what the other actually wanted. Construction began in 1925 and took 21 months. The building that rose at 6th Avenue and Washington Street was extraordinary. 9 stories of Indiana limestone in the Gothic Revival style, with a tower visible from a mile away. The sanctuary seated 950 beneath ribbed vaulting that evoked the great English cathedrals. Stained glass windows, carved stone, ornamental ironwork. The total cost reached $800,000, a figure that in today's money exceeds $13 million. Adjacent to the church stood Seaman Hall, the community wing that embodied Seaman's vision of a total institution. It contained a theater seating 1,000, a full gymnasium with a basketball court, a swimming pool, classrooms for religious education and vocational training, meeting rooms for civic organizations, a kitchen and dining hall. The entire complex consumed a full city block. It was, at its opening, the most ambitious church-building project in the Methodist denomination. Seaman filled it. By the late 1920s, City Methodist claimed 1,700 members. The pews were full on Sunday mornings. The gymnasium hosted youth leagues in the evenings. The theater staged plays and concerts. The swimming pool taught children to swim. Seaman preached muscular, socially engaged sermons that addressed the conditions of the city directly. He was not a quiet pastor, he was a civic force, and he was progressive on race in ways that made the city's power structure deeply uncomfortable. Seaman advocated for integration at a time when Gary's schools, neighborhoods, and social institutions were rigidly segregated. He invited black speakers to the church. He argued publicly that the segregation of Gary's schools was morally indefensible. This stance put him directly at odds with the white establishment, including many of his own congregation's wealthiest members, who had no interest in disrupting the racial order that kept property values high in their neighborhoods and labor costs low in the mill. Seaman's position eventually became untenable. The details of his departure from Gary are complex, but the outcome is simple. The man who built the church was pushed out of the city he tried to reform. He left in the 1930s, and City Methodist continued without him, a monument to ambition that had already begun to lose the animating spirit behind it. The decline was slow at first. Membership held through the 1940s and 50s, supported by the mill's continued operation. But the church's fate was always tied to the fate of the city, and the city's fate was always tied to the mill. As Gary's white population began to leave in the 1960s, the congregation shrank. The neighborhood around 6th and Washington changed demographically, and City Methodist, like most white Protestant churches in changing neighborhoods, did not change with it. Membership dropped from 1,700 to a few hundred, then to a few dozen. The costs of maintaining a 9-story limestone building did not drop with the membership. The roof leaked, the limestone eroded. The heating system, designed for a full sanctuary, consumed enormous amounts of fuel to warm a half-empty building. The swimming pool was closed. The gymnasium fell into disuse. Seaman Hall went dark. By the 1970s, the congregation could not afford basic maintenance. By the early 1980s, City Methodist Church closed its doors. The building that was meant to prove Gary's permanence became the most photographed ruin in the city. Its sanctuary roof collapsed in sections, letting rain and snow into the nave. Trees took root in the accumulated debris. Birds nested in the clear-story windows. The stained glass was stolen, panel by panel. The carved stone crumbled. Graffiti covered the walls of Seaman Hall. $800,000 in 1926, money. $13 million in today's dollars. A 1,000-seat theater, a 950-seat sanctuary, a swimming pool, a gymnasium, a tower visible from a mile away. All of it built on the assumption that the corporation would keep running the mill would keep employing the workers would keep filling the pews, and the pews would keep paying the heating bill. Every link in that chain was forged by U.S. Steel, and every link broke in the same order. Chapter 6, The Bet on a Single Number. In 1960, Gary was the 70th largest city in America, and every dollar of its prosperity depended on the continued willingness of one corporation to keep one mill running. The numbers look strong on the surface. Gary's population in the 1960 census was 178,320. The mill employed over 20,000 workers. Property tax revenues funded schools, police, fire departments, and the full apparatus of municipal government. Broadway still functioned as a regional shopping district. The Memorial Auditorium still hosted major events. The city had a mayor, a city council, a planning department, and every outward sign of civic health. But underneath the population count lay a structural vulnerability so profound that economists would later use Gary as a textbook case of single industry dependence. Manufacturing accounted for nearly 50% of all employment in the city. Of that manufacturing employment, the overwhelming majority was concentrated in one complex, Gary Works. U.S. Steel was not merely Gary's largest employer. It was, directly and indirectly, the source of virtually all economic activity. The steelworkers spent their wages at Broadway stores. The stores paid rent to landlords. The landlords paid property taxes. The property taxes funded the schools that educated the steelworkers' children, who would grow up to work in the mill. The entire economy was a closed loop with one valve, and the valve was controlled by a corporate headquarters in Pittsburgh. No major employer had ever established a significant presence in Gary outside of steel. The reasons were structural. The city had been designed for steel. Its infrastructure, its labor force, its zoning, its transportation network were all oriented toward the mill. A company looking to locate a new factory or office complex would have found a city with abundant blue-collar labor, but limited white-collar talent, excellent rail connections, but limited highway access, and a political establishment that had spent 50 years serving one client. Gary was a company town, and company towns are, by definition, hostile to diversification. The first cracks appeared not in Gary, but in Tokyo and Osaka. Japan's steel industry had been destroyed in World War II and rebuilt from the ground up in the 1950s with the newest technology available. Japanese mills used the basic oxygen process, which could produce a ton of steel in 40 minutes. American mills, including Gary Works, still relied heavily on the open hearth process, which took 8 to 12 hours per ton. The productivity gap was enormous, and it would only widen. At the same time, automation was beginning to reduce the number of workers needed per ton of steel produced. New continuous casting technology eliminated entire steps in the steelmaking process. Computer controls replaced manual monitoring. The trend was clear. The same mill could produce the same amount of steel with fewer workers every year. Gary Works was producing more steel in 1960 than it had in 1940, but it was doing so with fewer employees. The employment peak had already passed, even though the city did not yet know it. U.S. Steel's response to these competitive pressures was fateful. Rather than investing heavily in modernizing its existing mills, the corporation chose a strategy of gradual retreat. It deferred maintenance. It delayed the adoption of new technology. It allowed its older furnaces and rolling mills to continue operating long past the point at which they were competitive. The reasons were financial. Modernization required billions of dollars in capital investment, and the corporation's shareholders expected dividends, not construction bills. So, U.S. Steel squeezed profit from aging plants while its foreign competitors built new ones. This was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of incentive. The corporation's obligation was to its shareholders, not to the city of Gary. If the numbers said that investing $2 billion in Gary Works would produce a lower return than investing the same money in acquiring Marathon Oil, which U.S. Steel did in 1982 for $6.6 billion, then the money went to oil and Gary got nothing. The corporation was doing exactly what a corporation is designed to do. The problem was that an entire city of 178,000 people had been built on the assumption that what was good for the corporation would always be good for them. By 1960, the question was already answered if anyone had been willing to hear it. The automation trend would reduce employment at Gary Works by at least half within 2 decades. Foreign competition would drive down prices and margins. The aging infrastructure would become increasingly expensive to maintain. The white middle class, already beginning to move to the suburbs, would accelerate its departure when the jobs started disappearing. The tax base would shrink. The municipal budget would be cut. The schools would decline. The commercial district would hollow out. The buildings that U.S. Steel had built to attract and retain workers would become empty shells. None of this required a conspiracy or a catastrophe. It required only the ordinary operation of markets and the ordinary behavior of a corporation following its financial interests. The collapse was not an event. It was a process running on the same logic that had created the city in the first place. The math had always been the foundation, and the math was changing. Chapter 7. Last one out. Please turn out the lights. Between 1970 and 1980, Gary lost more than 20,000 steel jobs, and then the white population began to leave, and then the stores followed the customers. The cascade started with the global economy. In 1973, the OPEC oil embargo drove energy costs through the roof, hitting energy-intensive industries like steel hardest. Japanese and European producers, who had invested in modern equipment while American mills aged, gained further advantages. Imported steel rose from 5% of the American market in 1960 to over 20% by 1980. Smaller domestic producers, the mini-mills, began eating into the market for standard products like rebar and structural beams, using electric arc furnaces that were cheaper to build and cheaper to run than the massive integrated mills. Gary Works responded the only way an aging, underinvested mill could, by cutting workers. 10,000 permanent layoffs came in the mid-1970s. Another 5,000 followed before the decade ended. Each layoff notice rippled through the city like a stone dropped in a pond. A laid-off steelworker stopped buying groceries at the Broadway store. The store laid off a cashier. The cashier stopped paying rent. The landlord stopped paying property taxes. The city reduced the police force. The neighborhood got less safe. Another family decided to leave. The departure was not random. It followed the racial geography that had been built into Gary from its founding. White workers and their families, who had more savings, more mobility, and more options, left first. They moved south to Merrillville, Hobart, Portage, and the other towns in Lake County that were growing as Gary shrank. Black workers and their families, who faced housing discrimination in the suburbs and had fewer financial reserves, stayed. The result was a demographic transformation that was also an economic catastrophe. The people leaving took their incomes, their property tax payments, and their retail spending with them. The people staying inherited a city built for 3 times their number, with infrastructure costs that did not shrink with the population. The commercial district died in stages. Sears, which had anchored the east end of Broadway, relocated to Merrillville in the early 1970s. The decision was a body blow. Sears was not just a store, it was a destination, the kind of anchor tenant that drew customers to an entire district. When Sears left, it signaled to every other retailer that the future of regional shopping was in the suburbs, not downtown Gary. The signal was confirmed in 1974 when South Lake Mall opened in Merrillville. It was a modern enclosed shopping center with climate control, ample parking, and the clean, safe, predictable environment that suburban shoppers demanded. It captured the regional shopping market within a year of opening. One by one, the stores on Broadway closed or relocated. J.C. Penney, Goldblatt's, the smaller shops that depended on foot traffic from the anchors. Broadway went from Northwest Indiana's premier shopping street to a corridor of locked doors and papered-over windows in less than a decade. The population numbers told the story in the bluntest possible terms. Gary's 1970 census recorded 175,415 residents. By 1980, the count had dropped to 151,953. More than 23,000 people had left in 10 years, and the pace was accelerating. The 1970s were not the worst decade. They were the beginning. Inside the mill, the workforce that remained saw the future clearly. Older workers who remembered the days of 30,000 employees now walked through sections of the plant that were silent. Furnaces that had run continuously for decades were cold. Rolling mills stood idle. The corporation was not shutting Gary Works entirely. It was doing something more psychologically devastating, keeping it open at reduced capacity, maintaining just enough production to justify not closing it, while steadily reducing the number of people it employed. The workers who survived each round of layoffs knew that the next round was coming. The question was never if, only when. By 1980, Gary had entered the feedback loop that would define the next 4 decades. Fewer jobs meant fewer residents. Fewer residents meant less tax revenue. Less revenue meant worse services. Worse services meant more residents leaving. More residents leaving meant fewer jobs. The loop had no natural stopping point. It would continue until either something broke the cycle or the city reached some irreducible minimum, a population of people too poor, too old, or too attached to leave. The Magic City was becoming something else. The buildings were still there, the Gothic church, the atmospheric theater, the Beaux Arts station. They still stood on their foundations, their limestone and brick unchanged. But the life that had filled them was draining away, and no one had any idea how to refill it. Chapter 8. The Mayor Who Fought a Disappearing City. Richard Hatcher won the mayoralty by fewer than 2,000 votes after the FBI intervened to stop voter fraud targeting black neighborhoods. And then he spent 20 years governing a city that was collapsing beneath him. The 1967 election was a battle over who would control Gary's future, and it nearly destroyed the democratic process in the attempt. Hatcher, a young black attorney from Michigan City, ran against the Lake County Democratic machine, which had controlled Gary politics for decades and had no intention of yielding power to a black candidate. The machine's candidate was backed by the county organization, the business establishment, and a political apparatus that had delivered votes, legally and otherwise, for a generation. Hatcher's campaign galvanized Gary's black community, which by 1967 constituted a majority of the city's population. But the machine fought back with every tool available, including, federal investigators later determined, a scheme to add thousands of fictitious names to the voter rolls in white precincts. The FBI intervened before the election, identifying fraudulent registrations and forcing them to be purged. On Election Day, Hatcher won by 1,389 votes. He was one of the first black mayors of a major American city, elected the same year as Carl Stokes in Cleveland. The victory was historic. What followed was the education of a lifetime. Hatcher took office in January of 1968, inheriting a city whose economic foundation was already cracking. He was brilliant, charismatic, and connected to the national civil rights movement. He had the ear of Robert Kennedy, who campaigned for him. He had credibility in Washington that no previous Gary mayor had possessed, and he used that credibility to channel hundreds of millions of federal dollars into the city over the next 2 decades. The money built public housing. It funded community development programs. It supported job training. It paid for the Genesis Convention Center, which opened in 1981 on the site of the old Emerson School, a gleaming glass and steel facility designed to host conventions, concerts, and trade shows. Hatcher envisioned the convention center as a catalyst for downtown revitalization, a new anchor that would draw visitors and business back to a city that was losing both. But the convention center could not defeat arithmetic. Gary's tax base was shrinking every year. The mill was laying off thousands. The white middle class was leaving by the tens of thousands. Federal money could fund construction, but it could not fund the ongoing operations of a city whose expenses were designed for 178,000 people, and whose revenue was coming from a population that would drop below 120,000 by the end of Hatcher's tenure. The impossible math defined everything. Streets built for 178,000 residents still had to be plowed, patched, and policed, whether 120,000 people lived on them or not. Water mains and sewer lines did not get shorter when families moved away. Schools did not shrink when enrollment dropped. The fixed costs of a city are brutal when the revenue base collapses. Gary was paying to maintain infrastructure for a city that no longer existed, using money from a population that could barely support itself. Hatcher's most visible triumph outside Gary came in March of 1972, when the National Black Political Convention gathered at the Westside High School gymnasium. 8,000 delegates from across the country came to Gary to draft a black political agenda. Jesse Jackson spoke. Amiri Baraka presided. The convention made national headlines and established Gary, for a brief moment, as a symbol of black political empowerment. It was the largest gathering of black political leaders in American history to that point. But conventions end. The delegates went home. The national attention moved on, and Hatcher was left with the same broken calculator he had started with. Through the 1970s and 80s, Hatcher fought a war on multiple fronts. He battled U.S. Steel for tax revenue the corporation constantly sought to reduce. He fought the Lake County political establishment, which never fully accepted his leadership. He struggled with a city workforce demoralized by declining wages and worsening conditions. He watched the brain drain accelerate as every talented young person who could leave did leave. Engineers, teachers, doctors, accountants, entrepreneurs. The people a city needs most to rebuild are the people most able to go somewhere better. The convention center did not save downtown. It could not. A convention center in a city with no hotels, no restaurants, and no safe parking was a building without a context. Visitors came for specific events and left immediately afterward. The surrounding blocks continued to empty. The stores continued to close. The population continued to fall. Hatcher served 5 consecutive terms, from 1968 to 1987. No one can question his dedication. He gave 20 years of his life to a city that was sinking, despite every effort to keep it afloat. But the forces arrayed against him were not political. They were structural. A single mayor, however gifted, cannot reverse the economic logic of a company town when the company decides to leave. In 1987, Hatcher lost his primary to Thomas Barnes. The defeat marked the end of an era, but the underlying story had not changed. Gary was still losing people, still losing money, still losing hope, and the worst was yet to come. Chapter 9. The Night Gary Burned. On October 12, 1997, a series of fires swept through the heart of downtown Gary, and by morning, 8 buildings were either destroyed or gutted, and no one was ever charged. The fires began in the Goldblatt's department store building on Broadway, a structure that had been empty for years. They spread quickly through the connected buildings of the old commercial core. By the time the Gary Fire Department responded, the flames had reached the Memorial Auditorium, the $5 million civic palace that had once hosted 6,000 people for concerts and conventions. The Radigan building caught fire. The Genesis Towers complex, the former Hotel Gary, was damaged. Embers drifted across blocks. The downtown burned with an intensity that overwhelmed a fire department already stretched thin by years of budget cuts. By morning, the damage was catastrophic. 8 major buildings had been destroyed or structurally compromised. The Memorial Auditorium, Gary's greatest civic building, was a shell. Goldblatt's was a ruin, the heart of the old commercial district, already hollowed out by decades of decline, was now physically destroyed. No one was ever arrested. No one was ever charged. The investigation, to the extent that one occurred, produced no conclusions that were made public. In a city with functioning institutions and adequate resources, an arson that destroyed 8 buildings in the downtown core would have been a major criminal investigation. In the Gary of 1997, it was something closer to a shrug. The buildings were already empty. The insurance, where it existed, was already cashed. The city had no money to investigate and no political will to pursue answers that might implicate powerful interests. Conspiracy theories filled the vacuum. Some blamed landlords seeking insurance payouts. Some blamed developers who wanted to clear the land. Some blamed the city government. The truth may be simpler and sadder. In a city where the commercial core had been dead for a decade, the buildings were worth more as insurance claims or cleared lots than as standing structures. The fire may have been started by anyone with a match and a motive. In a city full of abandoned buildings, both were abundant. What followed the fire was a parade of promises, each more hollow than the last. In 1999, Donald Trump announced a $10 million plan to build a Sheraton hotel and casino complex in Gary. He appeared at a press conference. He made pledges. The hotel was never built. The money was never spent. Trump moved on to other projects, and Gary was left with nothing but a press clipping. Muhammad Ali's name was attached to a restaurant venture that was supposed to bring visitors to the city. It never opened. The details of the deal dissolved into the same fog of broken promises and disappeared investors that characterized every redevelopment scheme Gary attracted. In 1996, the Miss USA pageant was held in Gary at the Genesis Convention Center. The event was meant to showcase the city's potential. Instead, it exposed its reality. To prevent the national television audience from seeing the ruined downtown, crews covered the broken windows of the Palace Theater on Broadway with plywood facades painted to look like functioning storefronts. The illusion lasted for the duration of the broadcast. Then the cameras left, and the plywood came down, and the broken windows were exactly as they had been before. In 2007, the Paramount Pictures production of Transformers: Dark of the Moon used City Methodist Church as a filming location. The production company paid the city $1,550 for the privilege of filming destruction inside a real ruin. The irony was suffocating. A Hollywood crew spent millions of dollars creating fictional destruction in a film about alien warfare, and they chose to shoot in a building whose actual destruction was caused by nothing more exotic than corporate withdrawal and municipal poverty. The real ruins were more dramatic than anything special effects could produce. By the turn of the millennium, Gary had become something unique in American urban history. A city whose decline was so complete that its ruins had become its most famous feature. Urban explorers posted photographs of City Methodist's roofless sanctuary, the Palace Theater's crumbling proscenium, the abandoned schools with desks still in the classrooms. The images circulated worldwide. Gary became, in the popular imagination, a synonym for American decline. Business Insider named it the most miserable city in America. The city that U.S. Steel had built to project permanence and prosperity was now famous for the opposite. It was not a city anymore. It was a set for fictional apocalypses and a backdrop for articles about everything that could go wrong. The fires of '97 were not the cause of this transformation. They were the punctuation mark. Chapter 10. What grows in the ruins. Trees now grow through the collapsed roof of City Methodist Church, a rooftop garden that Pastor Seaman planned but nature delivered in the cruelest possible way. Stand inside the sanctuary today, and you look up through a shattered vault of limestone ribs to open sky. Birch and maple saplings rise from the debris on the nave floor, their roots wrapped around fallen masonry. Moss covers the walls to a height of 6 feet. The stained glass is gone, every panel stolen or shattered. The carved stone tracery of the window frames remains, holding nothing. Rain falls directly onto what was once the altar. In winter, snow accumulates in the pews. The building is simultaneously a ruin and a forest, a place where human ambition and natural reclamation exist in the same frame. City Methodist received a Knight Foundation grant in 2010 for stabilization, an effort to prevent the building from collapsing entirely while preserving it as a managed ruin, a monument to what was. But managed ruin is an expensive concept, and the money needed to maintain even a controlled decline exceeds what any current organization can sustain indefinitely. A few blocks south, at 791 Broadway, the Palace Theater continues its own slow collapse. John Eberson's atmospheric ceiling, with its painted Mediterranean sky and electric stars, has been open to the elements for years. The plasterwork crumbles. The ornamental columns are stained with water damage. The stage where first-run Hollywood films played to full houses in the 1930s is now a mound of fallen plaster and rotting wood. No preservation effort has gained sufficient funding to begin work. Union Station tells a different story. The Beaux-Arts Rail Depot, which closed to passenger service decades ago, was adopted by a volunteer preservation group called the Decay Devils. Led by activists who believe that Gary's architectural heritage is worth fighting for, the group has invested over 2,000 volunteer hours in cleaning, stabilizing, and advocating for the building. Their work has kept Union Station from following City Methodist into total ruin. It remains standing, its limestone facade battered but intact, its interior stripped but structurally sound. The Aquatorium, a distinctive cylindrical building on the lakefront, originally built as a bathhouse and community gathering place, was rescued and renovated, one of the rare success stories in Gary's preservation landscape. It now functions as a community space, a small proof that not every building the corporation built has to die when the corporation leaves. The broader landscape is less hopeful. Approximately 1/3 of all residential structures in Gary are abandoned. Entire blocks consist of empty lots where houses have been demolished or collapsed. The population, which peaked at 178,000 in 1960, stood at roughly 68,000 in the most recent estimates. The demographic composition tells its own story. The city is approximately 81% African American, a proportion shaped by the Great Migration that brought black workers to the mill and the white flight that followed deindustrialization. The city government struggles with the math of decline. Fewer residents generate less tax revenue. Less revenue means fewer services. Fewer services make the city less attractive to new residents or businesses. The loop that began in the 1970s continues to turn. Each revolution removes a little more, and yet, people remain. 68,000 people still call Gary home. They send their children to school. They worship in churches that are not ruins. They mow lawns next to empty lots. They live in the city that the corporation left behind, and they do so with a persistence that the corporation's spreadsheets never accounted for. Chapter 11. The New Owner of the Machine. In 2025, Nippon Steel Corporation of Japan purchased U.S. Steel for $14.9 billion, and the mill that created Gary now belongs to a company headquartered 5,000 miles away. The acquisition was the final transformation in a story that had been turning for a century. U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation, the company that built Gary from sand dunes and ambition, was purchased by a Japanese steelmaker in a deal that was contested, delayed, and politically fraught. Nippon Steel committed to an $11 billion investment program in the acquired mills, with Gary Works identified as a centerpiece of the modernization plan. The most visible element of that commitment is a $350 million blast furnace relining at Gary Works, a project that would extend the productive life of the mill's core equipment by decades. For a city that has watched the mill shrink for half a century, any investment of this magnitude carries enormous symbolic weight. It says, at minimum, that someone believes Gary Works has a future. But the numbers tell a more complicated story. Gary Works remains the largest integrated steel mill in North America. Its furnaces still produce millions of tons of steel annually. Its coke ovens, blast furnaces, and rolling mills still operate around the clock. But the workforce that runs this enormous complex numbers roughly 2,256 people, where 30,000 workers once streamed through the gates at shift change. A few thousand now enter a mill that automation has transformed from a labor-intensive operation into a capital-intensive one. The steel still gets made. The jobs do not come back. The Nippon Steel acquisition raises the question that has hung over Gary since its founding. Can corporate investment save a city that corporate withdrawal destroyed? The new owners are investing billions. But they are investing in the mill, not the city. They are investing in blast furnaces and rolling mills, not in Broadway storefronts or residential neighborhoods. The distinction matters. A $350 million furnace relining creates construction jobs for a few years and preserves 2,000 permanent jobs. It does not create the 30,000 jobs that sustained Gary at its peak. It does not reopen the department stores. It does not refill the neighborhoods. The city itself is reaching for a different kind of future. In 2026, Indiana designated the Midtown Broadway Cultural Heritage and Music District as the state's first recognized cultural main street, honoring a historically black neighborhood. The designation acknowledges what the original corporate planners never intended, that the neighborhoods south of the tracks, the communities the Gary Land Company ignored, created their own culture, their own music, their own identity. Midtown was home to jazz clubs, barbershops, churches, and the daily life of a community that built itself without corporate assistance. The Cultural Main Street designation is an attempt to build an identity and an economy around that history. The Decay Devils continue their preservation work, expanding from Union Station to other threatened structures. Their model is based on sweat equity and community engagement rather than corporate funding. They host volunteer days, give tours, and maintain a social media presence that has brought international attention to Gary's architectural heritage. They represent something the original Gary did not have, a preservation movement that is not waiting for the corporation to decide what survives. The question that hangs over all of this is whether the company town model has already answered itself. U.S. Steel built Gary. U.S. Steel abandoned Gary. Nippon Steel is investing in the mill that U.S. Steel built. But the city around the mill is not the mill. The city is the people, the streets, the schools, the churches, the stores, the parks. And the city has been dying for 50 years while the mill, in reduced form, continued to operate. Can a different corporation write a different ending? Or is the lesson of Gary that no city should ever again allow its fate to be written by a corporation at all? Das er statist. Chapter 12. The Transaction That Ended. Gary's ruins are not the ruins of a civilization that failed. They are the ruins of a transaction that concluded. This is the distinction that matters. When you stand inside City Methodist Church and look up through the broken vault to the sky, you are not looking at the aftermath of war or natural disaster or civilizational collapse. You are looking at what happens when a line item is removed from a budget. The church was built because the corporation needed sober, stable workers, and a grand church was a cost-effective way to produce them. When the workers were no longer needed, the church was no longer needed. The logic is clean. The ruin is the evidence. Every beautiful building in Gary was, at its core, a retention strategy. The Palace Theater existed because a workforce that had access to entertainment was less likely to quit and move to another mill town. The Hotel Gary existed because visiting buyers and executives needed a place to stay. Union Station existed because the workers needed to arrive and the steel needed to leave. The Memorial Auditorium existed because a city that hosted conventions and concerts felt like a real city, and workers in a real city felt more invested than workers in a company camp. The architecture was genuine. The beauty was real. But the motive was economic, and when the economic motive expired, the architectural commitment expired with it. The numbers complete the story. $65 million spent to build a city in 1906, 178,000 people at the peak, 30,000 mill jobs, Broadway as the retail capital of Northwest Indiana, a Gothic church seating 950, an atmospheric theater with electric stars, a Beaux Arts station, a $5 million auditorium. These are the numbers of creation, and then the other numbers. 20,000 jobs lost in a single decade, a population falling from 178,000 to 68,000, one-third of all homes abandoned, 8 buildings burned in a single night, a fire department too small to fight the blaze, a police force too stretched to investigate, a Transformers crew paying $1,550 to film fake destruction in a city already destroyed, a Miss USA pageant covering broken windows with plywood. These are the numbers of abandonment. The gap between those two sets of numbers is the measure of what a company town costs its residents. U.S. Steel lost nothing when Gary collapsed. The corporation had extracted decades of profitable production from the mill and had no obligation to the city beyond what the law required. When the steel could be made more cheaply elsewhere, the corporation reduced its investment. When the workforce could be reduced through automation, the corporation reduced its workforce. When the mill's share of production declined, the corporation declined to reinvest. At every stage, the corporation acted in its financial interest. At every stage, the city paid the price. This is not a story about greed. U.S. Steel was not more rapacious than any other corporation of its era. It was not less generous. It was a corporation, operating according to the logic of corporations. The error was not in the corporation's behavior. The error was in building a city on the assumption that a corporation's interests and a community's interests are the same thing. They are not. They never have been. A corporation exists to generate returns for its shareholders. A community exists to provide a stable, decent life for its residents. These goals overlap when business is good and diverge catastrophically when business declines. Gary is the proof. It is the most complete demonstration in American history of what happens when a community surrenders its economic fate to a single entity, and that entity exercises its right to leave. The lesson extends beyond Gary. Every community in America that depends on one factory, one mine, one military base, or one tech company is living in some version of the same arrangement. The details differ, the architecture is different, the timeline may be longer or shorter, but the fundamental structure is the same. A community's survival depends on decisions made by people who do not live there, do not vote there, and have no obligation to stay. Gary's ruins are the monument to that truth. The limestone of City Methodist Church crumbles a little more each winter. The Palace Theater's Mediterranean sky fades in the rain. The streets that were laid out in 1906 still follow their grid, but many of them now run through empty lots where houses once stood. The mill still operates, scaled down to a fraction of its original workforce, now owned by a corporation based in Tokyo. The blast furnaces still glow at night, a diminished version of the second sunrise that once lit the sky over Lake Michigan. 68,000 people still live in Gary. They are not extras in a documentary about decline. They are residents of a city that was built by corporate will, abandoned by corporate calculation, and sustained against all odds by the stubbornness of people who refused to leave when the spreadsheet said they should. The corporation moved on. The people remain. And that, in the end, is the difference between a transaction and a community. A transaction ends when the numbers change. A community endures because the people in it decide it matters. Gary is broken. Gary is still here. And the question it poses to every city in America is the same one it posed in 1906, when a lawyer named Armani's Knots was secretly buying sand dunes for the richest company on earth. Who owns the place where you live? And what happens when they